Welcome, everybody. This is the fourth instalment in our spring interdisciplinary lecture series. And thank you to Lesha and Nicole for handling the tech as usual and the Q&A. If you have questions, just type them into the chat and we'll sort through them at the end of the lecture. Tonight's speaker is Randall Mason. And the concept of this interdisciplinary lecture series is that we draw on the incredible talent that we have right here in our own school. And I wanted for you, the students primarily in the audience, to have an opportunity to hear from the incredible people that we do have right on our doorstep. So that's what this is all about. Randy teaches in the graduate program in historic preservation. As most of you would know, he's a full professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning. When I first came to Penn, everyone was really quick to say that the historic preservation program here was one of the very best, if not the best in the nation. And, you know, a bit like landscape architecture, historic preservation is necessarily interdisciplinary. And so Randy is therefore something of a polymath. I mean, he teaches subjects that cut across preservation, conservation, history and cultural landscape studies, and planning and architecture. His research interests include the history and theory of preservation, preservation planning, the economics of preservation, historic site management, and the history and design of memorials. In that regard, he leads two research groups at the moment, the Penn Praxis Urban Heritage Project, and Randy for some years was the director, of course, of Praxis. The Penn Praxis Urban Heritage Project undertakes planning, preservation and cultural landscape projects for the National Park Service, and as well as other clients. And then he also directs the new, and this is super exciting, a new initiative which is titled the Centre for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites. And I don't know, but Randy, I'm presuming you'll mention that tonight in your talk. This research centre conducts research, teaching and fieldwork related to Black heritage, places marking civil rights histories. Randy's books include The Once and Future New York, Historic Preservation and the Modern City, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2009. This book received the Antoinette Forrester Downing Award. A second book, Giving Preservation a History, Histories of Historic Preservation in the United States, edited with Max Page, published by Routledge in 2019. And then a third book, an edited volume titled Values in Heritage Management, published by Getty Publications also in 2019. So finally, Randy is just a great colleague, and it's a real pleasure to have you here tonight, Randy. So thank you for doing this. And if everyone can join me in welcoming Randy to the stage. Over to you, Randy.
Thank you. I will now ascend the stage here in my, my home office. Thanks, Richard, for the kind introduction. Thanks to all the organizers for the invitation to talk to the Landscape Architecture Department, which I'm very fortunate to have you all as colleagues, especially in landscape architecture. Been very fortunate to work with you guys and just enjoy all the shared interests and shared concerns that we have. And I think, as Richard has already prefigured, one of my points is that there's a really strong alignment between landscape architecture as an enterprise and historic preservation, at least my end of it, as an enterprise. Preservation means a lot of things to a lot of different people. But what I hope to show is that through a little bit of professorial lecturing, if you'll forgive that for a few minutes, and then probably of more interest through a couple of projects, I'll try to demonstrate the kinds of alignments that I think are really strong and link together landscape architecture, past, present, and future, with the past, present, and future of historic preservation as well. So the original title that I think Richard must have given to my talk, which I did not even honor by putting it on the first slide, was by the preservationist. And so it's a label that I understand, but I don't really accept the IST label in the sense that historic preservation, like other design fields, doesn't prefigure a solution, and the label preservation IST, I think in the public mind does tend to kind of prefigure a solution that preservationists always are trying to stop change and are sort of against creating new things and new places, and that is, I think, manifestly untrue over time, even though that's the impression. So the title that I gave to the talk, Culture and Landscape, was I thought a kind of a more generous container to talk about a bunch of different things, a bunch of different ways that landscape architecture and historic preservation are linked. What I think is probably the best title, and the kind of the last one I'll give it, is that the talk is really about cultural landscape, which, as I'll argue, is a hinge, or kind of maybe just a shared ground, if you will, between landscape architecture and preservation that has been really important to me personally over my education and my career, and I think continues to be a concept, a tradition, a way of looking, a way of practicing that really joins all of the design fields together, and I think creates a really important both mode of practice, but also a kind of mode of responsibility, that every time we talk about landscape, we're also thinking about culture, as we also are, kind of automatically thinking about nature. So the outline of how I mean to spend my between 45 and 60 minutes is to talk about two ideas and two-ish projects. I'll spend hopefully about 10 minutes talking about these kind of bigger ideas, and then the balance of the time talking about two projects that I worked on for pretty long periods of time, and then kind of not a more recent project, but a subject that points to the current work that I'm most engaged in, which, as Richard said, has to do with the Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites. Before getting into that, I won't try to kind of re-give any sense of my bio or all the projects I've worked on, but I did want to give kind of just a little bit of a taste of some of the most recent and current projects that I and my colleagues are working on, if for no other reason than to open up a wider range of subjects for questions later in the evening. I'm happy to talk about, obviously, the two main projects that I'll spend most of the time talking about, but I did at least want to kind of put a flag in the ground about the Miller House and Garden, which is a kind of an outlier project for me, in the sense that I fairly rarely work on designed landscapes with a capital D. I think most of you probably know Miller House and Garden as the apotheosis of the modernist domestic landscape. It's Saarinen House, Saarinen and Kevin Roach House, done in concert with Dan Kiley Landscape and Alexander Gerard Interiors. Extraordinary place that we're engaged in a conservation plan for the building and landscape at the moment. In the middle of the slide, the Armstrong School, a small rural schoolhouse outside Tuskegee, Alabama, is a current project working on with students at the moment, and we'll be continuing to work on that with colleagues at Tuskegee University. It is a building and a cultural landscape of the Jim Crow South, a landscape of segregated educational institutions, separate but unequal education institutions, and a rare remainder of that period. And then at the bottom, just a couple of the more urban projects that which are mostly what I work on. We've been doing planning, preservation planning studios in Detroit neighborhoods for the last several years. Some of the consulting projects that we've worked on include a plan for the Historic Center of Salvador da Bahia in Brazil as part of the 100 Resilient Cities project that we did as a consultant to ARUP London office. And then on the lower right, a placeholder for about 10 years worth of projects and counting of cultural landscape reports and cultural landscape studies that we've done for the National Park Service in Washington, D.C., where the National Park Service, for strange reasons, holds hundreds of public parks and landscapes, and has a great deal of responsibility for public space in DC. So to get on to part one, just to make the point that of the alignment between landscape architecture and historic preservation, it principally begins as a matter of scale. Landscape architecture and the kind of historic preservation that I take on happens at larger scales and therefore larger complexities. It fundamentally engages with both natural systems and processes and patterns and cultural systems and processes and patterns. To me, the link between the two fields resides at the level of cultural geography. And I say that as a kind of a selfish point, because that was my education. I was first educated as a geographer, and I continue to think about think about the world in the ways that cultural geographers do, which is to say, fundamentally kind of a matter of spatial pattern and process, as well as historical pattern and process. In a lot of ways, I feel like Richard kindly referred to my checkered past as being a bit of a polymath. I really feel like I kind of haven't declared my major in a certain sense. In that cultural geography, I think, as it's applied in different ways in different settings, is really the kind of underpinning for landscape architecture, for city planning, for historic preservation, for any of the design fields that engages the world at complexity and at scale, and importantly, that does a really deliberate job of trying to understand and study the world as we find it, as we inherit it, before attempting to transform it and change it. And that's, I think, a really important difference between the discipline of geography or cultural geography and the design fields, as that cultural geography kind of ends at understanding, whereas, of course, landscape architects, preservationists, architects, and planners, we are out to change the world, to transform it, hopefully in intelligent ways. And so within the tradition of cultural geography, there's this really important concept of cultural landscape, which I'll talk a bit about its kind of history and evolution over time. But that is a really important shared concept and a shared set of a kind of intellectual tradition, if you will, that's shared between the two fields. I'm sure that most of the landscape students have read things like Dennis Cosgrove or Jim Corner's early work, which cites people like Dennis Cosgrove and J.B. Jackson and other cultural geographers who wrote about or have been writing about for decades, if not more than a century, about cultural landscape as a concept, and a concept that is in fact operationalized by landscape architecture first among other fields. So at its most simplistic level, and in the hands of Carl Sauer, one of the American geographers who first coined the word cultural landscape in English, there's this really kind of simplistic notion that cultural landscape was simply the kind of endpoint, the result of the idea of a culture, a group of people working on a natural landscape over a period of time. And one can look at it as this kind of simplistic diagram from his 1925 book suggests, as a kind of a profound yet simple concept. Culture is the agent, the natural area is the medium, the cultural landscape is the result. So from the start, there's this sense that the cultural landscape as a concept is really kind of important and powerful in the sense that it bridges these two very long and quite separate traditions of physical geography and human geography, understanding change over space in terms of the natural world and the cultural world, if you will. And especially as it is used as a lens to study particular places in particular moments, cultural landscape centers the researcher on human-environment interaction. And of course, in the early 20th century, this is done in a very static way. And over time, it has gained complexity, it has gained political nuance, it has gained, kind of theoretical complexity as well. But I think it's important to kind of recognize the roots of some of these concepts. Especially in historic preservation, especially as used by the historic preservation field, cultural landscape and the work of cultural geographers gives a really important model, if you will, of looking at any kind of heritage place, whether it's a building or a landscape or a whole region, in the sense that one can understand over time layers being built up. And as a geomorphologist would say, a process of differential erosion, layering up and denuding, layering up and denuding over time and over space, creating this complex pattern that may seem nonsensical from first view, but on analysis, one can discern the different layers, the different processes, the different materials that compose this complex cake, or if you will, palimpsest, the kind of 50-cent word that professors tend to use to talk about a place where one wants to discern different layers, having different kinds of qualities, different values over time. Palimpsest, of course, were these sort of pre-paper kinds of texts that were written on, partially erased, written on, overwritten, so that you can see different layers from the single view. If one asks the person on the street about like what is a landscape, I think it's as likely as not that they'll think of something like this: a landscape as a genre of art. And although art history is not our purpose tonight, I think it's artistic traditions of representing landscape are an important part of the kind of the potential and the evolution of the cultural landscape concept. Works like Thomas Cole's, and of course the many others who painted in this genre, are very important in this sense of contributing a strong aesthetic set of tools, both representational tools and visualization tools that can contain, that can contain a great deal of complexity, of showing in a holistic sense how culture and nature, how humans and environment are relating to one another, and at least to capture it in a moment. And in this, these vast canvases capture a lot of actually different ideas within one frame. So it captures nature and culture. It captures natural processes and cultural processes, captures different emotions and feelings connected to the place. It also refers, depending on how deeply one analyzes it, things like economic narratives and economic systems, and so forth and so on. So a whole lot within the frame of the landscape work of art to kind of follow through on the promise of cultural landscape as this really complex notion of interweaving cultural and natural processes and contingent uses of nature. I think that one of the depredations of landscape painting and Hudson School landscape painting and otherwise is that one tends to appreciate their static qualities, which kind of works against deeper and more dynamic understandings of how landscape and cultural landscapes work. To kind of counterpose the static painting with the work of another artist much more recently, the novelist John Berger, who created, some of you I'm sure know his work. He created these wonderful novels that were usually illustrated with photographs of the place that he was writing fiction about. And with this nice little kind of poetic quote, I think makes the point really beautifully. Landscapes are maybe beautiful, but they are deceptive. They may seem to be a setting for the life of its inhabitants, but they are really more like a curtain behind which the struggles, the achievements, the accidents, the processes, the conflicts take place. So at our peril, we see landscapes or landscape works of art as static. We have to understand what's hidden in the landscape view, that it's not merely aesthetic, it's not merely visual, that we have to understand the politics and the cultural difficulties that underlie the scene. There are of course, other landscape traditions that we can look to, whether it's Rembrandt's drawings of the Dutch countryside in the 17th century, the nascent field of photography. This is a Carlton Watkins view of Yosemite in 1861. I think it's the first photograph of Yosemite. But again, these beautiful, those static images, I think, tend to work against using cultural landscape in a more dynamic way, which is to say a way that's more useful to us designers as we try to understand how they change in order to manage that change. And then so ultimately is the kind of end point to this section of the talk. In the end of the day, cultural landscape kind of treated as a visual mode is really kind of unsatisfying for all that it doesn't tell us, all that it doesn't show us, or all that it seems to conceal. And my favorite image of this, and for those of you who are listening, you may have taken my cultural landscapes class, you'll recognize this image. I will always show it in the class and say, well, what are we seeing? Since we're on Zoom, I can't ask you to raise your hands and do that. I'll give it away. The title of this photograph is Alaska Pipeline, taken by a photographer named Skeet McCauley. And I think it wonderfully encompasses the kind of that deceptive quality that John Berger referred to, and just in general, the kind of richness of the cultural landscape concept of trying to understand a place in a radically holistic manner, radically holistic in the sense of understanding it through time, understanding it across space, and understanding it across the different kind of disciplines and ways of knowing that we have of landscapes, whether it's natural sciences, physical sciences, art, humanities, personal experience, and aesthetic in that kind of full multi-sensual way. In a way that I think cultural landscape is intersectional in its own way, not borrowing the term that has been applied to otherwise these days to other social issues. I think to bring it back down to the work of designers, it frames for us a challenge of understanding multiple, interwoven, and changeful systems. Again, like the idea that cultural landscape is not a static notion is really important. And in my mind, it's a really important approach, not just to kind of certain, beautiful scenic views or scenic places, or certainly of just designed landscapes. Cultural landscapes are really the basis for an approach to all kinds of planning and design and other kinds of projects. Incidentally, it is also canonized or reified, if you will, as a National Park Service methodology for documenting and managing and designing national parks. And I'd be glad to answer more questions about that later. The last question conceptually that I wanted to leave you with is a great one that was posed really beautifully and directly by Robert Cook, who you all may know was around the Honorable Arboretum at Harvard for a long time. Is landscape preservation an oxymoron? With a reasonable question if one thinks of historic preservation as being all about static states, about taking something back in time, about stopping change. It's a great provocative question, I think, that again is a good kind of bridge between the ideas of landscape architecture and the ideas of historic preservation. And the answer is not at all, because preservation is also a dynamic design process, just as landscape architecture is. Okay, so let me pause for a second and take a sip. Check the clock to see how fast or slow I'm going, hopefully not too fast. And now I'd like to spend a somewhat bigger chunk of time talking about two projects. One is an historical project. I didn't design the Bronx River Parkway and didn't redesign any part of it, but I did do a long historical research project on it. And I wanted to kind of foreground the takeaways or the kind of lessons that I wanted the case to demonstrate for the moment. Sorry, just one little computer glitch there. I wanted to first acknowledge that I think for those of you who are historians or have taken your history of landscape architecture course, you'll recognize that it occupies this really significant place in the history of landscape architecture, designing and realizing the first limited access highway with grade separations, with verges, with ecological performance built into it. But that's really just the kind of tip of the iceberg of its significance as a 30-year project, 30 years in the realization. It was really a landscape restoration project in my mind that had aspects of advancing ecological conservation, automobility, real estate development unabashedly, and also, and this relates to the current moment where we're trying to reckon with civil rights a little bit more centrally. It was a project of ethnic and racial cleansing, very, very unabashedly. But it's, of course, not usually remembered for that. It's usually remembered as the first limited access highway. So let me give you a little bit more view of a little more dimension of the project. So when the Bronx River Parkway was first conceptualized, was in the very early part of the 20th century. It was essentially designed and built between 1906 and 1925. At a moment when New York City was transforming from a city to a metropolis. As one of my old advisors, Ken Jackson, used to say, the turn of the 20th century is when New York truly becomes the capital of capitalism. And truly becomes, because of the 1898 consolidation and other reasons, a metropolis spanning the 5 boroughs as we know it today. So the Bronx River Parkway is really happening up here, connecting the Bronx to Westchester County. Can you all see the little hand as I wave it around? Is that working?
Yes.
Thank you, Karen. As I wrote about in this book from 10 or 12 years ago, the Bronx River Parkway is the subject of a whole chapter in here. This book is ostensibly about historic preservation and the part it plays in creating the modern city, the modern metropolis. And I was really keen to take the story out of the old center, the historic center of New York, and see how it was, how historic preservation was playing a role in shaping the city on the periphery. And the Bronx River Parkway was one of those peripheral projects where it was a great frame to study how basically the cultural landscape was being reconceptualized and transformed on the edge of New York. A combination of these kind of technical and practical projects of creating a roadway, cleaning the river, rehabilitating the land in a literal way, but also satisfying cultural projects, which is to say, the kind of racial and ethnic cleansing of the people who lived around the Bronx River. This is the kind of a propaganda poster, for lack of a better way to frame it, that was published by the Bronx River Parkway Commission, with the public agency that built the river, the parkway. And one of the things I'll try to point out here is that here's the botanical garden and the Bronx Zoo. And this is the source, the mouth of the Bronx River. It stretches all the way up about 15 miles into Westchester County. And so the project was about 15 miles long and encompassed land that was already quite urbanized, public landscapes that had already been built and in operation, the zoo, and then all of this kind of rural landscape of rural industry and scattered villages, turning that into essentially a suburban landscape. This is the picture that I think we most often recognize of the Bronx River Parkway, the roadway itself, allowing this perfect mobility of uninterrupted speed, speeds up to 25 or 30 miles per hour, which were remarkable in that day. You can see the freshly planted verges here. The river lies back here. The aerial, the aerial view encompasses very nicely the path of the new parkway, which of course undulates both in both vertical and horizontal directions to take advantage of the contours of the land. It includes what they would call the reservation, which is basically the land here between the railroad tracks and the property lines here. That would be managed essentially as a public park at first, and provide access to what you see here and here in Scarsdale, massive new middle and upper middle class suburban real estate projects. And it was the connection between these was very clear. One of the commissioners was always a real estate developer. The before and after scenes and the photography connected to the project is really wonderful. Others have studied this as well. Tom Campanella, who some of you may know, has also studied the Bronx River Parkway, and also it's the guy named Gilmore Clark, who was associated with the Bronx River Parkway. It's essentially his first job. And Clark and Rapuano went on to design a great deal of very influential landscapes around the country and the world. But these, as the caption says, scenes of desolation along the river were captured as the before scene, which, and just like a Repton Red Book, was meant to be the kind of counter to the finished product. So here we have the sources of pollution along the Bronx River. You can see a little factory building in the back, the kind of decrepit foundations and a bulkhead. And then here's the finished project. And these were published in books where this would be the left side, and this would be the right side. And here's another view along Williams Bridge. And you can tell this is, in the kind of visual narrative, the degraded land and the improved land, cleared and treated. And here, essentially, the edge of a neighborhood that is, I wouldn't say a down at heels neighborhood, but not a high class neighborhood, mostly cleared. This building in the back was actually retained and preserved as the commission's offices. But as you can see as the place is described, after the buildings and shacks have been removed. So there were in the design of the parkway, and this is part of the Historic American Landscape Survey documentation of it. The plans were very detailed in what would be built, but it's important to also read the narrative alongside the plans that were constantly devalorizing and kind of undermining any of the pre-existing landscapes as kind of worthless and dirty and destructive, even though some of them were actually quite just like perfectly fine working class neighborhoods. The other thing I'll point out about the parkway itself is that the way it was financed, managed, and organized was absolutely the kind of apotheosis of modern infrastructure building. This was a proud diagram that they always used in their annual reports, showing the organization of the commission and all the different departments, how they related to one another. You can see here Gilmore Clark was the later on. This is, I think, later in the process, the construction superintendent, but was trained as a landscape architect at Cornell. The commissioners were the ones who were in charge of it. This guy, Madison Grant, who I'll talk about in just a moment, remember his name. The last thing I wanted to show you was the kind of on the ground repercussions of what this landscape transformation looked like, again, before and after, in its most, debased instances. And this is in White Plains, New York, and this is down in the river bottom. This shows you existing conditions, essentially. The green shading is the land that has been acquired for the reservation. Again, in between the railroad that already existed from the 1830s and the kind of project boundary that was going to be publicly acquired through eminent domain. And you can see in the green area, there are dozens and dozens of buildings, and these are mostly houses, these are factories. This is a whole community that I'll show you in just a moment. And the rationale for this, just as Olmsted had provided the rationale for his parks in the 1870s and 80s by making economic arguments that if this land is improved and transformed, it will essentially be a moneymaker for the public agency and for the state. This is from one of the annual reports, which shows the increment, like this is how much we spend and this is how much we make from increased tax revenue. So it was very clearly making a robust argument on aesthetic grounds, on economic grounds, and environmental grounds, and tacitly as a matter of kind of ethnic cleansing. Because even though the language in describing the pre-existing landscape was always devaluing it, there was very rarely any statement about needing to remove these people because they were degraded people. And here's the last instance I'll show you. This is in that map that you saw a moment ago here. Here is what was essentially a community of Sicilian immigrants. Here is their church in the foreground at right. Keep your eye on that white house up on top of the hill. That's after clearing and right after replanting. That White House is the only thing that's left. And reading through all of the files about eminent domain takings and people being displaced and having to accept basically whatever sum that the government gave them for their land, it became clear that through the correspondence that because these people were Sicilians, they were regarded as as lesser people, as non-white essentially. And so that this is the last slide for the Bronx River Parkway, but I think the kind of the exclamation point at the end. Probably not many of you know who Madison Grant was. He was very, very popular and well known in the early 20th century in the US because he was probably the most popular author of books about scientific racism and race theory that demonstrated in their minds, not actually, the supremacy of whites. His most popular book was called The Passing of the Great Race, which was about how white Nordic peoples were being degraded and diluted by admitting immigrants from different parts of the world. So he rarely even deigned to write about Black-skinned people, or certainly African Americans, only because he regarded that as kind of kind of an obvious point. Now, of course, I don't mention Madison Grant to praise him in any way, only to note as a matter of context that the culture, the society that built the Bronx River Parkway regarded this as a laudable project, among other reasons, because it displaced these Black and immigrant populations from the area around the river and transformed and improved it in a way that should be absolutely celebrated, as this opening ceremony that you can see here was indeed. And this is Grant himself giving a speech. He, over the 20 plus years that he led the Bronx Parkway Commission, he never missed a meeting, once a month. So this was absolutely a very important project to him. And one of the reasons we don't know much about him, or he's not much talked about these days, is his family destroyed his papers after his death. And it is said, although I don't know if it's fully documented, that one of the reasons is because there were complimentary letters from Hitler, who had read Passing of the Great Race and his other books and praised him as a kind of a great thinker in terms of white supremacy and scientific racism. So this indeed is the part of the heritage of the Bronx River Parkway. Among its other stories, as a cultural landscape, we have to reckon with this aspect of its story and its presence in New York City, as all of the other kind of technical and design aspects. So I should probably be able to finish this next case again in about 10 minutes, and then I'll be happy to get to the Q&A. So please think of what questions you may have about Bronx River Parkway or what comes next. So I had the great honor to work in Rwanda for about 5 years. From about 2014 to 2019, colleagues and I worked with the Rwandan government and other partners, both NGOs, also our State Department and the American Embassy in Kigali, on a multifaceted project to deal with historic preservation and conservation of memorials to the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. Which I won't talk a lot about the details of that, but if you're not well informed about it, there are plenty of ways that you can do that. What I will want to argue is that in the very exhaustively pursued and exhaustively documented conservation of and commemoration of the genocide over 25 and more years, one of the real losses has been losing the sense of the landscape that was experienced by those who were killed in the genocide. The kind of visceral, spatial experience has essentially been erased through a combination of development of the country, as well as the conversion of a few sites around the country to memorials that really try to capture the experience of a whole landscape in the space of a small site. So that that process of converting sites of a landscape of memory into sites of memory, I think has been in cultural landscape terms has been a kind of a notable and an unfortunate shift. I would say that it's arguable whether that is a reasonable price to pay for the conservation of the official memorials, which perform a very important function in Rwandan society and in Rwandan politics in a controversial way. But I'll try to kind of unwrap, briefly introduce the commemoration process and show you a couple of examples about how the kind of the gain of really well conserved sites or conserved sites has come at the loss of landscape. And the three takeaways that I hope that ring true as you think about this tonight or tomorrow is that Rwanda presents a really interesting and instructive case about the different aspects of traumatic heritage and traumatic heritage places and the processes of conserving them. That has, I think, lessons for lots of different countries, lots of different societies who have undergone or are undergoing trauma and try to use conservation and historic preservation to try to reckon with those traumatic pasts. Secondly, it really forces us to understand the influence of economic development on commemoration and on the transformation of landscapes. Well beyond what we intend, the processes unleashed by development in all of its forms, whether it's tourism or resource extraction or energy production, what have you, has this extraordinarily strong and often destructive force on cultural landscapes. Western guilt is also an important factor in Rwanda specifically, because because global society, mostly Western powers, effectively decided not to intervene to stop the genocide in 1994. after it was over, there was a kind of a flood of offers of philanthropic and development assistance that has really shaped the kind of remarkable rebound of Rwanda in the 25 years since the 94 genocide. And lastly, and this is like more of a kind of a pointy-headed academic point, but it's I think an important link between the Rwandan experience and the experience of many other cultural landscapes where we work, is that it enters into this process that the French historian Pierre Nora has written a great deal about, this historical process of transforming environments of memory, places where memory is more lived than constructed, or what in French he calls milieu, and converting those places into sites of memory where the memory is kind of compressed and fenced to be experienced in a kind of deliberate and almost kind of univocal way in a museum at an historic site, so called and so fenced, as opposed to being experienced in the landscape at large. So this process of converting milieu de mémoire into lieu de mémoire, environments into sites, I think is an almost ubiquitous process in anywhere in any modern country. So with that as both the kind of the introduction and the conclusion, let me show you a little bit about what I'm trying to argue. Just to locate you for a second, Rwanda is in East Africa, is a landlocked country of about 11 million people. It is the densest country in Africa and intensely rural. The largest city, Kigali, has more than 1 million people and is growing very quickly, but it is still a largely unurbanized country. And the region of Bugesera, I should have said at the outset, the Bugesera is a region of the country. It's not a single place, as this map suggests. Is a region where the two places that we've done most of our work, our team has done most of our work, are located in this region. That is a really extraordinary place. This is an historic map from the 50s, I believe. It's kind of almost unreadable, but it makes the point that in this part of Rwanda, as in most parts of Rwanda, everything is in slope. There are very few flat places. You can see that the marshland around this meandering river called the Nubaranga River is one of the few kind of extensive flat landscapes. And it makes it clear that why the country has the nickname of the land of 1,000 hills. And some of the places that you'll see in a moment here, this called Narama, and another place called Nyamata. These are two of the sites of the memorials that we worked on. And I just will pause for 1 second to, as I said at the outset, I don't want to replay a lot of the details of the genocide, but I think some basic facts are in order to understand the magnitude of it as a transformation of Rwandan society. In about 100 days in 1994, from April to August, 800,000 people were killed. And most of them were killed by hand, person to person. So it was an incredible kind of pulse of violence. There are many reasons for it, and I won't try to characterize those, but an extraordinarily high number of people were killed, and the country was really kind of in ruins at the end of it. Actually, I won't go into that. So we were privileged to, I think Nick Pevsner might be on Zoom, and there he is. A couple of years ago, as part of the first time that we took a team there to begin to study these memorials and to work on them. We over 5 years spent almost I would say 90% of our time working at this site, which is called Nyamata. Was built as a church in about 1970, a Catholic church, and became a memorial because, like many other public buildings, the genocidaire, the Hutu, mostly Hutu genocidaire, told people to gather at public buildings like churches and schools in order to, they told them that they would be safe there, but they essentially used these places to contain victims, and then thousands of people were killed over days at these particular sites. So the 8 national memorials that Rwanda maintains today, most of them were these kinds of pre-existing public spaces that were used as essentially as instruments of the genocide. It is a remarkable building. I won't go into the details unless somebody asks later. But one of the most important parts of the memorial at Nyamata is what's contained inside the walls of the church, which you can't see from the outside. But inside, on the pews in the church, are piles and piles of clothing. These are the clothes of the victims who were killed on the site. That were over a long time separated and piled in this manner in the sanctuary of the church, which of course creates some of the conservation problems that we have been trying to deal with, of how to slow down the deterioration of these clothes while retaining the way that they are displayed as an interpretation of the genocide of it's a really kind of a powerful, simple and powerful image that you enter the church and you sense the absence of the people by the presence of their clothes. And again, you see them as a mass, but as you walk up to the piles, of course, you can immediately recognize individual articles of clothing. So it works. It's got kind of tremendous power and depth to it, a very simple strategy. This is the site taken from a drone, which I wanted to show you to reinforce this idea of the memorials being kind of hyper compressed and defined literally by fences. This is the fence, and these are the trees planted around the fence to separate the memorial from the landscape around it, which in this case is a landscape of other religious institutions, schools and convents, and there's another church just off to the right. This is the main road that connects the capital Kigali to the left to the Burundian border to the right, and it's just on the edge of a largish town called Nyamata, just a market town. The old sign, again, we refer to them as sites because they are these, kind of very, well demarcated, kind of almost like a museum exhibit in the sense that there's a very clear threshold, clear inside and outside. It's very, very well patrolled, and the security is very tight. There's always an armed guard. So these places are really, all of the memory is kind of packed into these really well-contained places. Very nearby, Nyamata is another of the 8 national memorials, also a small country church. This one is called Harama, Ntarama. And this one this place has been, we did studies here, but we weren't really, we gave advice about this, the conservation of this place, but to be honest, our advice was not taken. And this site was transformed in ways that make really kind of touching the loss of landscape with the gain of a kind of a more thoroughly elaborated and built up memorial site. So this is the church building, simple, passively lit and ventilated church building. This was a small outbuilding that was the vestry and a latrine. It was covered 10 years after the genocide. Some British engineers donated this lovely metal hood that sits over to this day. We actually advised them to leave it there because we thought taking it away would actually cause more damage to the building. But of course, the hood changes a great deal, the aspect of the site as it would have been experienced in 1994 by the thousands of rural Rwandans, mostly Tutsi, who sought refuge here and were killed here with their families. What is retained at Harama is the damage that the genocidaires made to the church as they entered it to kill people who were hiding inside. So whether with mortars or with other instruments that breaking through the walls of the church, you can see those have all been retained as part of the memorial. The landscape dimensions of it, which I'll focus on for the rest of my talk, are evident in these aerial views. They're not of great quality, so hopefully you'll be able to see these. So here again, here's the main road. It's a dirt road in 2014 when we first got there. It's now paved. This is the church building and the other outbuilding. You can see, of course, the metal hoods. There's another metal hood on two other outbuildings just north of the church. You can see that this is the property line of the memorial, that the government, kind of bought this from the church, from the Catholic Church, to create it as a memorial. But you can see it's part of a continuous and extensive landscape that is typical Bugeseran agriculture, small fields that are mixed, and you will see some close up in a moment. This little housing development is a post-genocide philanthropic project of building these small houses on little garden lots. But the kind of more traditional Rwandan village life is contained in these compounds and these small houses and compounds right along the road. And we'll see those in a moment too. So this was the site as we first approached it in 2014, and it had been gradually developed as informally and then formally as a memorial from about 1998. On the site, there among the kind of extraordinary but subtle parts of the landscape are these groups of trees called umuvumu trees, which are kind of ficus, that were planted in the 50s and 60s when Tutsis were exiled to this region, which is not very rich land. When houses were built, the umuvumus were planted in the yards of the houses. So essentially today, these clumps of umuvumu, this is just up the hill from the church, that one and this one as well. These are essentially memorials to missing houses of the Tutsi that were destroyed during the genocide. But they're not really treated as memorials. I mean, they are treated as memorials in the sense that they are not cut down. But the way that they have been treated since, and this is a view from all the way up the hill, looking back toward the church here. Here are the clumps of umuvumus. Here you can see this is the property line. And on the other side of the property line is the neighbor's banana grove. Most farms include banana groves as well as planted fields for corn and beans and other plants. This is the kind of wildish or old field kind of nature of the memorial in 2014. If you go a little bit further up, you get into people's fields, and here's the corn getting not quite as high as the professor's eye, but you can still see the church down here and the distant hills, the kind of endlessly rolling hills. Pause a second to think for a second about why it's important to have these distant views of the hills. One of the really kind of heartbreaking parts of how Tutsi experienced the genocide in this region is that during the night, the families would hide in the churches and schools and public buildings. During the day, in order to avoid the genocidaire, the kind of packs of militiamen traveling around to murder people, women and children would often leave the church and go down across the hills, down into the valleys to hide in the marshes. And then so there's this kind of daily traveling from hilltop to marsh and back as a way to try to avoid the genocidaire. And of course, there are these incredible first-person stories about parts of families surviving, whole families being dispatched in this way. But this was part of the reality of the 100 days, that it wasn't just a kind of a momentary pulse of kind of madness and violence. It was 100 days of experiencing it spatially, as well as in all the other dimensions. And this is the kind of landscape dimension that is in fact being lost by the overdevelopment of places like Harama. Here's a construction project in process, where they're building new and hardened trails, they're putting in new foundations. They are managing to not tear down the umuvumu trees, but their context is being totally changed. This is a museum building going up just next to the umuvumu trees at Harama. That same path looking the other way, here's the museum building. This is a temporary construction building. These are the umuvumus we saw before. And this is a path that is just gonna get, slam kind of right around it. And so the results, as I'll try to finish this up quickly, the result is that this is the photograph you saw before from 2014 of the 4 buildings under the 2 hoods, this small site. The site is now much larger. And it includes a number of parking lots here and here, new buildings here, 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 here. So a massive building program and hardening of the site that also not only walls it off from the agricultural landscape around it, which is such an important part of the 1994 context, it's also destroyed some of the village context. And if you look at this parking lot, for instance, looked like this in 2014. These little characters, running around the road, and this was not a heavily trafficked road. This is just kind of the village path, with these mostly mud brick houses in various states of repair. And then this is what it looks like today, with this new parking lot with stone walls. The road is now actually paved and blacktopped in order to be prepared for the larger number of international visitors to come. So the last few slides I wanted to show you, and I'll finish up altogether, is just to reinforce this idea that one of the important memorials to the genocide, in my mind, is the cultural landscape of the whole of Bugesera, which means somehow retaining the ability to experience, or at least understand, the different parts of the landscape that people used in different ways as they tried to survive the genocide. So whether it's traveling here to the river bottoms and hiding among the different plants and the different soils and the river in the valley bottoms, and then traveling up to the hilltops. This is a photograph of the remaining stanchions of a bridge that was one of the few bridges over the New Baranga River that was subsequently replaced by another bridge that you can't see just to the right. But there was a proposal, unrealized, to create a memorial here because many people were actually killed on the bridge. And so if this was pulled into the kind of memorial ecology, if you will, I think that would be a better way a more powerful way to understand the landscape dimensions of the genocide. Some of the most powerful experiences I personally have had of this is being taken by our Rwandan colleagues and friends to these places where the people who were hiding at Harama Church would travel down the slope into the river bottoms. Here's one of those kind of clearings where people would go down, as you can see in the distance, and these 2 folks are standing on the hilltop. There is one memorial to the kind of the experience of those who were killed down on the river bottoms, and it's this place. It's kind of a freestanding gate and fence on the edge where you can see here the river bottoms. You stand up here at the top of the ridge. So this is what I would think of as the kind of most powerful landscape memorial, which is simply a place, strangely like a Thomas Cole painting or a photograph, where you can simply understand a view and contemplate that view and all that it shows you and all that it hides, in the sense that John Berger was telling it. And I think for the folks who kind of own these stories as their own heritage, these places that are unbuilt, that are kind of the landscape as inherited and not transformed, are just as powerful, or powerful in different ways, from the carefully curated and exhibited and fenced national memorials that I showed you earlier. So with that, I will actually zip through the last part I was going to show, just in the interest of time. I'll give you another talk another time, if you like, on Black bottoms and landscapes of civil rights here in the U.S. But I'll just end with this and an invitation to reach out to me by email if you can't stay on the call tonight. Happy to talk about any of these issues at greater length with anyone who's interested. And I'm also, slight advertisement, teaching my cultural landscape course again next year in the fall. So if any of you landscape students want to study this in more depth, there will be a chance next fall. So I'll end there. Richard or Lesha, if you want to take over.
Great. Thank you, Randy.
Yeah, it was a really wonderful talk. Thanks so much for all of that. I learned a lot just from the past hour. So we have one question from Sonia, right off the bat. Sonia?
Thank you so much, Randy. That was wonderful. Yeah, I just have a couple of, some questions actually came up and they probably were already resolved, but maybe just to your last project, which, I mean, the landscape is phenomenal, and the subtle, so do I understand correctly that there was design involved in some of the subtle moves of how to direct, for example, the vista or the view of the person that you showed in the last image looking into that valley? Is there kind of some...
Only in the location of it. It was located in a place where people traversed up and down during the genocide. And there's a, kind of a little hillside installation where there are, some inscriptions on a polished wall. But mostly the memorial consists of a place where you can stand. You're not told where to stand, but a place where you can stand and just, take in that view.
Yeah, and so I think my first question relates to that particular site, because there were then indeed some interventions, if even very subtle, and if also maybe unfortunately not all of the ones that you were proposing or hoping for. How do you think kind of will subsequent generations come to this, find this, see this? Do you think, I mean, I would certainly have a tendency of hoping that, that's totally enough, and, and that would be, is there kind of a culture maybe in these places that is enough to perpetuate the remembrance over time?
It's a great question. The Rwandan government does not leave that to question at all. The government has formalized and controlled and managed the memory of the genocide, and as part of that, the memorials to the genocide in very strong ways. They haven't not left anything to chance, really. And in a way, it's remarkable that last memorial that I showed on the edge of the valley is still there, because I feel like I could talk for days and miss important things, but one of the really important processes over 20 years of memorializing the genocide is that the government has literally concentrated artifacts, remains, and visitable memorials in fewer spots. So these 8 national memorials are literally concentration points. Mm-hmm. And then there's a second level of district level, which is people kind of like counties. They're district level memorials where artifacts and So remains are still being discovered 25 years later. And when that happens, those remains have to go to a national memorial. So they've very clearly been trying to eliminate local memorials, or ones that are you might call them popular or kind of grassroots. So that's been a very purposeful concentration. At the same time, they've been doing a bunch of other things to kind of manage the memory of the genocide, including kind of truth and reconciliation kinds of processes, archiving, public education program, all of which are managed by the same agency, the folks who we worked with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so mostly it hasn't really been landscape interventions, but
no. The short answer would be that the landscape is being transformed in the interest of development.
Yeah,
it's not really a concern. The memorialization happens inside the fence.
Yeah. So I have two more questions, and I don't want to take up more time because there will be other questions. But maybe these are comments and questions. You can choose how to see them. One is I found it intriguing, to see your explanation. How milieu, did you speak of milieu, is transformed into the lieu of memoir, right? And so I was thinking of some sites in the Western context and in cities where I think in the last maybe 30, 40 years, we've seen, or actually kind of, goes much further back. So basically since the Second World War, we've certainly kind of seen a switch from, the memorial as a static artifact standing in public space to a memorial landscape or to a site. And so I was wondering, okay, what, in that case, that is a very modern, recent, relatively recent development to actually develop entire urban landscapes for that purpose and make them kind of, people, or make people let people experience in that way. And in what context, maybe, is there a useful comparison here or not at all, because it's just very, very different. Another thought was when Germany began to memorialize the deaths and the murder, genocide at the concentration camps, they called on landscape architects to do some of that work. And they tragically called in a lot of landscape architects who had actually been working under and for the Nazi regime, who were then subsequently even using the same aesthetic that they had been using, in order to express Nazi ideology before. And so that was kind of uncovered basically by historians beginning in the 1970s. So that's been an interesting kind of history of memorialization where landscape architects have been involved. Slightly different type of site, of course, but that also brings me then to another comment regarding Madison Grant, and you may have looked into this anyway, but landscape architects from Germany during the Nazi time came over to the US to study basically Gilmore Clark's creation of the parkway, and use that knowledge in their construction of the Autobahn. And so it's kind of, very likely, I would almost say that, that anecdote that you recalled, could be true.
Yeah, there's, I haven't had the heart to read it, but there's a really dedicated historian wrote about a 1,200-page dissertation on Grant, trying to cobble together letters that, of course, ended up in other archives. So I've only seen maybe a couple dozen letters that Grant wrote, but his archive being destroyed is usually a sign that there's something that someone wants to erase.
Yeah, and the connection seems very likely. And then even after the second, so it's interesting also to think about how after the Second World War, even notable landscape architects from Britain came over to study study that park system, but that parkway, but then also other, creations around motorways and so forth, and totally uncritically studied, researched, and then adopted certain principles. So the Nazis were the first, and then kind of followed by the Brits, who installed their system in the 1950s and so forth. So that was actually kind of really, really interesting for me to hear, because I didn't know about this, and so that could be kind of this whole new perspective on that part of history if one connected and sought to write maybe kind of a transnational history in this way.
I look forward to reading your book on that.
No, but thanks so much a lot for this.
Thanks, Sonia.
Okay, so our next question is from Nick Pesner, and he's asking about trees and memory. Nick?
Sorry, muted. Hi, Randy. So my question was about the umuvumu trees, and I apologize if you already talked about this, as my computer decided to crap out right when you were talking about the trees. But it's always amazed me how, they remained while the houses were burned and all the other traces of the former population disappeared. And now it's been over 25 years. So I was just curious, in your return trips to Rwanda, have folks brought up the trees? Have the trees ever stood in the way of development? And if so, what was the outcome? Did the trees prevail? Did they get cut down? Is it a generational thing? Kind of like the eco-warrior battles of the 90s in the Pacific Northwest, but then the next generation really doesn't have that same memory?
I think the generational issue is a big one, and I don't have an answer to it, because I know things have changed really dramatically. Before the pandemic, things changed really dramatically. I was there for the 25th anniversary, and it was a very kind of conscious pivot to basically kind of remember in a different way to a different end. Like, we're now talking about the future. That was the kind of official narrative. At Harama, the trees are still there as of the last time I was there. And it's not that they haven't put a fence around them or an interpretive sign or anything formal like that. I haven't really studied it carefully enough myself to say for sure. But I gather that it's kind of bad luck to tear them down. Essentially, kind of some version of it's bad luck. And despite the intense amount of concrete that has been poured at that site and intense amount of parking that has been now provided and paving, they do still remain as kind of silent witnesses. And read Nick's essay on them, because it's really good. You should put it in the chat, please.
Do we have any questions from the students? Not yet. Okay. I have one question that I'm going to try and frame simply. I think you answered it a few times during the talk, perhaps, but I think that the way that you opened the discussion with the cultural difficulties that lie underneath the scene in a painting is really interesting in terms of the way plans are often read, because that kind of political information often doesn't surface in a plan. So given that context, like these two ways of thinking or knowing, you talked about the intersection of these two ways of knowing. How do you think that they can become most powerful? Do you think it's through like a discursive space, or through drawing, or a combination of both? And then how do you see that kind of intersectionality starting to play out?
I think in kind of using different media to communicate the complexities of a place, that we wouldn't just use a plan. We shouldn't just use like a photograph or a painting. We'd also want to have narrative accounts and kind of a multiplicity of ways of knowing. And I think that's the kind of the implication of intersectionality or cultural landscape thinking. Is that multiple ways of knowing are necessary. And that can be as simple as, and I often use this as a kind of assignment in classes, a series of images with extensive captions, or, a narrative and photographs or images and captions, and to make sure that the ones using different ways of representation to do some justice to the complexities that kind of lie beneath. And if you happen to be a great novelist, be like John Berger and write great novels that that bring people to a place and keep them there, or you can make them travel around in ways that it's more like experiencing a place.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that answer.
So if you wanted to learn about Rwanda, I wouldn't just say like study these maps. I would say like read this novel, and read this journalist, and read these first person accounts, and I don't know, drink Rwandan coffee, and listen to someone speaking Rwandan.
But then I guess like when the work then becomes spatial again, like when you've done all of that research, and I guess you could think of that as site research or site exploration, and then the work becomes material, whether it's dispersed across the landscape, like you mentioned, encasing or visualizing the trees that are already standing, or in a building. Then like what do you think the best methods are or processes are for making sure that all that material is still there?
It's a combination of design and policy and management. Frankly, you have to you design it the way that you want the material realities to exist or to be created, and create policies that shape other people's decisions in the future. Policies are basically rules, so set the rules so that as things change, which they will, they'll change in ways that are more better than not. And then how a place is managed is probably the most underestimated or underutilized tool in a designer's toolbox. To make sure that there are people and resources and knowledge and to do the work of management in the future. That I think is almost always underestimated.
Okay, great, thanks. So Nick said in the chat that his essay is called Trees and Memory in Rwanda, and it's an LA Plus journey. And Allison has a question. Ali, would you like to turn on your screen now?
Yeah, hey Randy, thank you for that talk. I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit more about when there's a difference in the state-sanctioned narrative of memory and moving on, and then the lived experience. And I know that your role and your client in Rwanda is specific, and also it's not the place that you live and can know what counter narratives there are. But yeah, I'm just curious if you could reflect on how you see your role or a designer's role in general in that situation where you're navigating these different levels of memory and positions in memory.
Great question. That's the question I always fear. So our role working in Rwanda is compromised from the beginning. We have zero cultural ownership very, very little cultural ownership of any of those stories, other than the kind of the inaction or mismanagement of our government in not stopping it when they could have or should have. So our role is not to tell them how to interpret it. Our role, this is me speaking, not ours as a profession. Our role is not to to sort of establish what is best practice in our minds, and then just kind of leave it with them and say this is what you should do and do what you want. Neither is it to just walk away or not engage. We've tried to kind of thread the needle where we talk about a process of making decisions that we would use in our any other place that we would practice, and to kind of encourage them and enable them to make those decisions on their own, with us as kind of, I don't know, you call it maybe like coaches, And that's why the program is like the title on the grants that we had was a training program. We were training the Rwandan professionals in conservation principles and conservation practices, because there is no mode of training for that technical specialty in Rwanda. And so the folks who, the dozen Rwandan colleagues who had responsibility for conserving the sites within this bigger, very politicized framework, they just didn't have the knowledge or skills. So we were there to work with them to build that up. And as we do that, also to kind of impart on them, ways of thinking, very much like we teach in all of our master's programs. Here's what you want to know. So it's why and how you do research. This is how you would do different kinds of analyses. And then here are the range of ways you can respond. At Nyamata, where we did a lot more work and we made a lot more investment and we got a lot more invested ourselves, we were kind of partners with the Rwandans in making a lot of those decisions. But we did it over years. We were trying to be really careful about acknowledging our outsider status and enabling them to make the decisions that they thought were right. And there were plenty of things. There were plenty of constraints that we just totally accepted because they were Rwandan decisions that we would have walked away from in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, all the textiles in Nyamata had to stay on the site and in the church. So they couldn't be, the easiest way to conserve them would be to take them somewhere and put them in a controlled environment, and then they wouldn't deteriorate. So that would be the professional conservation solution. But that was never a possibility. So we had to invent something else. And we tried to invent it together as much as we could.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions, and there's one more from Agatha.
Hey, can you all hear me?
Hey, Agatha.
Hi. Thanks, Randy, for this talk and for everyone's questions and the subsequent answers. I had a question kind of going off, Ali, I guess part of Randy's answer to Ali's question about the textiles and the conservation. I was wondering about if there's any literature that you know of or theorizing on the use of clothing or kind of material worn by the body to re-emphasize the scale of the human body when it comes to memorials. I'm thinking of, displays of t-shirts that have names of gun violence victims on them, for example, and how provocative and haunting just the form of the human body can be when that body is then absent from trauma. And if there's any literature kind of discussing that you know of.
I'm not aware of. I think there must be, especially in museum studies and museum design. What I know of is I know through our colleague Julia Brennan, who was the textile conservator on our team, who has done this work in museums and on other kinds of trauma sites of trauma. And so I think most of what I learned through her. There's also a book that a friend told me about. I'm tempted to turn around and look in the bookshelf to see what the title of it is. It's basically like people being asked to tell a story about an article of clothing. So it's not about like museums or conservation or heritage or even design and that for that matter, but it's about this kind of intimate connection that I think you're referring to, that we have with clothes. So I would point you to any other things that Julia Brennan may have written. I can give you her contact info. It was an extraordinary find to be able to have her work with us over years, because one of her previous projects, and which she's actually still working on, is in Cambodia, working with Tolsang Museum on their collection of clothes of genocide victims. So it's like that's not a very well-defined specialty within conservation, but she happened to have this really extraordinary experience already, and a lot of the kind of design and management decisions that we ended up implementing came directly from her experience. and Michael Henry, my other colleague, who's involved from day one.
Do we have any more questions?
Right.
Okay, there's one more from Ali as well, a different Ali. Go ahead.
Yeah, Ali.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. Hi, Randy. I'm muted. I just had a question kind of following up to Allison's, and you talked, I think, a little bit about this, but about the community, like engaging with the community around the project and getting kind of that buy-in. Was that something that your team was working on, or was that something that the government was kind of engaging in separately and then incorporating into the work with your team? And then also, I was just curious about, like you talked about the stories about the landscape, like the people were telling about the trees. And I was just wondering about that kind of incorporating the oral history side of the landscape and how that's incorporated into these memorials.
Yeah. So I'll try to give a short and sweet answer. There's, on the good side, well, on the bad side first, it's probably the biggest departure from good professional practice in this project. We did almost zero community engagement because of our relationship with the Rwandan agency we're working with. They regarded that as their purview and theirs only, and they desired to keep strict control of it. So we were able to to have conversations with folks who happened to be visiting while we were there, or like workmen and things like that. But it was always in kind of informal ways and almost always through translators for linguistic reasons. I don't speak, none of us spoke in Rwandan. We have enough French to get by, but so sometimes it was in French and sometimes it was in, more fragmented English, but there weren't many opportunities for it by design. And we accepted that as a condition of doing the work, partly because of, on the good side, I mentioned this in relation to Sonia's question, the same agency that we work with, it's called CNLG, but it's the National Commission for the Fight Against Genocide. They take care of the memorials. They also keep archives of this 10-year-long community justice, grassroots justice process called Gacaca Courts. So they have this whole archive of all the peace and truth and reconciliation process. And they also keep first-person narrative archives, a number of which are translated and are shown in a museum in Kigali. And there are also a number of them in English on the website of the USC Shoah Institute. So first-person testimonies. And then there are a number of books that have been published of these first-person testimonies. So you can read them in French or in English, and so they're pretty widely available just to anyone who wants to read them. So we had to use those means of both working through our Rwandan colleagues and relying on published accounts to kind of be a proxy for our, the need to know what the community thinks of these places. The times when we actually did hire an anthropologist to work with us for part of the project, and in lots of ways, subtle and unsubtle, we were told that was not welcome. That's not part of what we're being invited to work on with them, and we should kind of basically like stand down.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. Thanks.
Okay, we have one last question from Cindy. Cindy, do you want to turn on your video and ask your question?
I will. Hi, Randy. How are you doing?
Hey, Cindy, good to see you.
Good. Hey, I just wanted to tap into an arena that you sort of spent the first part of your lecture talking about, and that is the name of your profession, historic preservation, and the degree to which you think it holds you back from maybe being able to make greater transformation. Because I often hear that about landscape architecture, that the name of our profession is perhaps working against our ability to be recognized, perhaps for a greater effort, and impact that many of us believe we can have. I'm just curious what your sense is about that.
So I would totally agree that there's a pretty significant mismatch or misalignment between the names of a lot of fields and the reality of what they do, what the field does, what the field desires to do in a way of ambition. And I think it's maybe more acute for historic preservation as a field than it is for landscape architecture or urban planning or any of the other fields that I've been connected to. I think they all are artifacts of, in fact, this moment in the early 20th century when they all kind of came into their current format, and it's there's a great deal of path dependence built into professional names, professional fields in lots of ways, including their names. So I think it's not exclusive to historic preservation, and I don't see it as a hindrance to me personally, but I do think that impressions of what people trained in historic preservation do sometimes suffers because of people's impression of what the name means. And I think I would certainly see that. I'm not a landscape architect, but I would certainly see that as happening with landscape architecture.
Yeah, I would say that in general, within academia, it's probably not felt as much as in the professional world, because you basically write your script and are working toward things that interest you. I mean, that's the purpose of the exercise in academia.
But also in academia, I think this is largely true in historic preservation, maybe in landscape architecture too, you tell me. Everyone in the field is also something else. Like in preservation, if you look at the preservation faculty, there are relatively few of us who have preservation degrees, but people are trained as I'm trained as a geographer and a planner and an historian. I don't have a preservation degree. Others are like an economist or an anthropologist or an engineer or a furniture conservator or what have you. So it's very clearly like our sense from within the field that we come from lots of different disciplinary backgrounds and professional backgrounds to work on a certain set of problems around which the field is organized.
Yeah.
And I think that's, that may be a little bit less true for landscape architecture because there's things like licensure involved in ways that for preservation, it's not. That's why in our school, like we're a graduate program and landscape architecture and architecture departments and planning as well. There's it's an acknowledgement that we're not preservation is not a discipline, it's a field. And I think arguably landscape architecture is a discipline.
Thank you.
Thank you for raising the preservationist question. Again.
I had to, I had to.
Damn you. Thank you, seriously.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. That was great. Thank you, Randy.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everyone, for
Really
the help
appreciate
and
it.
for the invitation.
Sure. Thank you. Good night,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. Good night.
Thanks, Nick.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.